is Tammy Gaskell. I'm the director of the Rojan Library, and I'm also currently chair of the Columbia County Libraries Association, which is sponsoring this program. And we've been holding a series of programs with the Martin Van Buren National Historic Site. And we're happy today to welcome Zachary Anderson, who will be talking about slavery and Martin Van Buren. We are doing this in a webinar format. It is being recorded, so we will post the link, and I'll let all of you know what that link is once it's up online. If you have questions during this, please put them in the chat, and I'll be looking at that, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. So I'm just going to turn it over to Zachary, and I hope you enjoy this.
All righty. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining tonight. So again, my name is Zachary Anderson. I'm leading this talk today on Martin Van Buren and his politics of slavery. When Van Buren is really a politician during his life and just his personal life as well, slavery is the leading social and political issue of his lifetime. You really could not go almost anywhere without being if you could say, confronted by it. It was part of daily conversation. It was politically everywhere. It was kind of just infiltrating every aspect of your life, and that held true for Van Buren as well. So we're going to go through this PowerPoint presentation that I have today for you, kind of just detailing you where maybe Van Buren stood on slavery. A lot of times we get questions from visitors who come to the park here, and they say, oh, well, I read that Van Buren, was an abolitionist. He was anti-slavery. And my job is to technically be the one to kind of burst some bubbles a little bit. Van Buren has a very interesting and very complex viewpoint on slavery that we'll try and dive into through this presentation today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you folks here. We'll kind of get the PowerPoint started and dive into this. Bear with me just one second, make sure everyone is good here. So this is Martin Van Buren, Politics of Slavery. So Van Buren is often regarded as being considered to be a Northern man with Southern principles. And what does that mean, maybe? So that's a very interesting statement for us, in that we don't 100% know what that means truly. Van Buren is kind of in a complex position, in that he is born in and around slavery. So what does that mean? So we're going to kind of go into my next thing here with maybe what does that mean? What does it mean to be a Northern man with Southern principles, as Van Buren was often labeled? And for that, you have to dive into where Martin Van Buren is from. He is from right here in Kinderhook, New York. Van Buren was born on December 5th, 1782, to Abraham and Maria Van Buren. His family owned a small tavern as well as a small farm, and within the household there were at least 6 enslaved individuals. So enslavement was not uncommon among Kinderhook households before the year 1827, which is when New York technically abolishes slavery. We'll talk more about why I put air quotes around this a little bit later. The national census from 1790 to 1820 shows Kinderhook held one of the largest populations of enslaved people outside Brooklyn, New York, which for such a small rural agricultural village, this statistic is pretty startling, considering that much of your population was enslaved people. It was not this white society that maybe we have come to know and recognize. I was born and raised in the state of Georgia, and so I did not learn about slavery here in the Northeast. So that was a kind of like a big changing moment for me when I moved up here, to kind of be presented by these other facts that there was slavery outside the Southeast. We knew it existed. I just didn't know to quite the depth that it did. And so working here has really kind of allowed me to dive into this new information. So Van Buren not only grew up amongst enslaved people, but along 6, again, held by his parents. This early exposure to slavery later provided him with an understanding of Southern politics that differed from many of his Northern colleagues. Many of them were not raised with the same experience that they had. They did not grow up in a rural agricultural village. They had collegiate educations. They were, maybe exposed to other lifestyles, whereas Van Buren really only knew what he knew here in Kinderhook and at his parents' house. Van Buren's own home, Lindenwald, which you can see again back here in this first slide, was first constructed in the year 1797 by the Van Ness family, who they themselves were prominent enslavers in the area. The Van Ness household enslaved at least 10 individuals, one of whom was a man named George. George himself actually escaped the property in the year 1804. An escape notice was actually posted in the local papers here on dated October 15th, 1804, which offered a $40 reward for George's capture. It is actually unknown if George, whether he maintained his freedom or if he was captured, as no further record actually exists. Now, kind of going back into this census records here of kind of how everything was working out. Very interesting here. It kind of broke down for you in 4 key years. So we have 1790, 1800, 1810, and 1820. Just kind of give you a general overview of the way the population numbers were kind of shifting and changing here in Kinderhook at the time. So Van Buren is born again 1782. So 8 years later, the population of Kinderhook, it's about 4,000 people. And the enslaved population is roughly 630. Of course, numbers are not perfect, but that's kind of where we're looking at that point in time. Jump forward 10 years, 1800, we're at just under 3,800 for the free white population. And then for the enslaved population, we're now at 403. Now, there's another number that I haven't mentioned yet, and that is the number of free Black people within Kinderhook. So the first year in 1790, there's only 6 in Kinderhook who are considered to be free persons of color or free Black men or free Black persons. However, in 1800, the number does jump to 69. It's still an incredibly small number, but there is some growth there. Now, 1810, we go forward, we're to 3,200 for the total population of Kinderhook. The enslaved population is down to just over 300, and the free Black population is up to 193. And then, very, very interesting, next 10 years, from 1810 to 1820, we've been on this downward trend, and all of a sudden, things are going to increase back up. The population as a whole for Kinderhook jumps to about 3,300. The enslaved population jumps back up to 431, and the free population does jump as well up to 232, but it's a much smaller jump than we saw from 1800 to 1810, now going from 1810 to 1820. And it's kind of interesting when this all kind of happens. So in 1799, which we'll talk more about in a few minutes here, New York passes their first gradual emancipation law. I'll talk more about kind of what that details in a few minutes here, but that happened in 1799. And so following year, we can't really tell how much of an impact that had. From 1800 to 1810, it looks like it had a pretty significant impact. But then from 1810 to 1820, it looks like maybe it didn't make much of a difference at all. And so if we're looking at the last set of numbers there in 1820, in 1820, the US Census reported 10,088 enslaved individuals within the entire state of New York. So if you take that number of 431 for Kinderhook, that represents 4.3% of New York's enslaved population is in Kinderhook. Again, outside of Brooklyn, New York, this is the second largest in the state. It's absolutely incredible for a town that only accounts for 0.2% of the entire state's population. They make up 4.3% of its enslaved population. So this is a very interesting quote here. This is actually in reference to Martin Van Buren's response to a very important landmark case seen here in our country, and that is the Dred Scott versus Sandford decision in 1857. And so Martin Van Buren, in response to Dred Scott versus Sandford, states that I am now convinced that the sense in which the word citizen was used by those who framed and ratified the federal Constitution was not intended to embrace the African race. I don't think we really recognize today how heavy that sentence, that statement sits with us. It is solidified. It's very matter of fact. Van Buren is stating that essentially people of color, other races in this country, this was not intended to apply to them. They are not citizens and they will never be citizens. And that's exactly what the the case decided that the United States Constitution was not meant to include American citizenship for people of Black African descent, regardless of whether they were enslaved or free. And so the rights and privileges that the Constitution confers upon American citizens could not apply to them. And here is Martin Van Buren, a former president of the United States, saying he agrees with this statement. And this is just 9 years after his final attempt on the White House, running with a party called the Free Soil Party, which is where most times the confusion comes in with Van Buren being considered an anti-slavery candidate or an abolitionist candidate, is due to his involvement with the Free Soil Party. But then this statement exists right here, and it kind of muddles things up again. So kind of transitioning on here into a bit of a timeline. So kind of wanted to structure the overall talk today here. So you'll see some key dates as we go through this time process, kind of going through Martin Buren's life and the key events of enslavement. So again, Van Buren himself was born in 1782 right here in Kinderhook, New York. 1790, 638 enslaved people living in Kinderhook. 1799, I mentioned earlier the Gradual Emancipation Act of 1799. So what does that detail? The Gradual Emancipation Law in 1799 stipulates that any child born to enslaved mothers on or after July 4th of 1799 would be freed no later than July 4th of 1827. Boys born after that 1799 date were enslaved until the age of 28, while girls remained in bondage until the age of 25, reaching this date of July 4th, 1827. However, the true date of this July 4th, 1827 is not really a fact. It reads like it is, but it's not. So if someone is born on July 3rd, 1827, they can still be enslaved until their 28th birthday if they're a male, or 25th if they are a girl. So it is not a true end date for enslavement. And this does nothing to the people who are already enslaved in the state prior to July 4th, 1799. So it's not a perfect scenario. And actually, at this point in time, New York is the second to last state in the northeastern part of the country to even begin an emancipation process of any kind. The only state who had not yet attempted to do anything was New Jersey. So we're only beating out New Jersey at this point in time in our history. So now we kind of have a big gap here from 1799 to 1817, and Van Buren's still a very young politician when this is kind of developing. Van Buren in 1812 becomes a New York State Senator and also the Attorney General for this state in 1815. So 2 years later, he is holding both of these titles, both Senator and Attorney General, and New York passes a second Gradual Emancipation Act. Now, this one is a little bit different and a little bit more encompassing. So the 1817 law extends to those born before July 4th, 1799. And they're going to say once again that it's establishing a firm date of July 4th, 1827 for emancipation. However, those enslaved under original 1799 emancipation are not included. And also, again, if someone is born on July 3rd, 1827, they can still be enslaved or indentured without pay until 1848, still making sure they reach that 20 or 25-year age limit. So it's not a perfect scenario. So if you're born before the 1799 original cutoff date, you are emancipated come July 4th, 1827. But if you were under the original 1799 Act, you can technically still be enslaved or indentured without pay until the year of 1848, just dependent upon your birthday. Absolutely, and just, yeah. So then 2 years later, 1819, Van Buren is still a New York State Senator, but he's beginning to consider taking his talents to the national level. Like, he's considered to be a great politician at this point in time. However, he declares slavery as being morally and politically speaking, slavery is a moral evil. It's a very rare expression in writing of his feelings about the issue. The statement made by Van Buren shows he considered the practice of enslavement immoral and wicked, but it's a moral evil. He benefited from it both personally and professionally. So he's recognizing it's not a good thing, but he's not willing to take that next step. And that's kind of a recurring theme that kind of goes on throughout most of his career. In 1821, at the New York State Constitution Convention, Van Buren actually votes to enfranchise free men, but as you can probably guess, with a catch. He endorsed extending suffrage universally throughout the state, extending the vote to all white men, regardless of property ownership, while effectively disenfranchising the state's African-American male citizens by requiring those to own $250 of free property in order to be able to vote. So now they're removing the property rights requirements for white men. So I myself could vote, that I don't own a home at this point in time. I could vote now. But a Black person in the same situation as me could not vote. They have to own $250 of property. So it's a one step forward, two steps back situation where Van Buren kind of is almost there, but not quite. While Van Buren was representing New York in the United States Senate, this is 1824, Van Buren receives a letter from a man named Alonzo G. Hammond in late December of that year. So far I talked about Van Buren's stances on slavery. I talked that his family had enslaved people. The house that he lives here eventually from 1841 to his death in 1862 had enslaved people at it. But what about the president himself? And so this letter that Van Buren receives in 1824 from Hammond is really our only evidence that Van Buren himself ever actually enslaved a person, but it is pretty convincing. So Van Buren's letter that he receives states, "I have ascertained that Tom, a Black man who you purchased of and who quit you some 10 years ago since, is now in the neighborhood of Worcester." I'm going to butcher this name because I'm not from the Northeast. So someone that is from Massachusetts, I apologize. But Worcester, Massachusetts. There is yet some time before he is free, as he is of that class, which will be free July 4th, 1827. So that means that Tom is applied, probably he was born before 1790. He was enslaved before 1799. "He was, when young, a slave of my father, and I think I can induce him to be of some service to me if I own him. I therefore take the liberty to inquire whether you will sell him for a small compensation. I can't think of giving much, as there is some considerable risk in getting him at all, and if I should get him, it is doubtful whether his services will be worth much," meaning Thomas Time is probably an elderly man, or at least elderly in terms of being what they would refer to as a useful enslaved person. "However, if you will take the trouble to write me with terms, I will then tell you whether I will purchase him or not and make the necessary arrangements to complete it. Please direct to Berlin, Rensselaer County, New York." So Van Buren receives his letter while he's serving as a United States Senator in Washington, D.C. And while he does not reply directly, it's not what we have in his papers, he did jot down a short note on the other side of the letter, writing that if he could get him without violence, he would accept a fee of $50 for the purchase of Tom. It never appears that Hammond made good on this offer. The letter suggests that Van Buren himself purchased Tom rather than inheriting him from his father or another Van Buren relative. And aside from this letter, Van Buren was rather quiet in regards to his own views on slavery at this point in his life. So he made that earlier one kind of condemning slavery, and now 5 years later, he's kind of keeping things very quiet to his life, as he will for the most part for the rest of his career and his life. So now fast forwarding to 1827, New York, again, here's this abolishes slavery. We kind of discussed, the different languages between the different Emancipation Acts of 1799 and 1817. So if you were born enslaved before July 4th, 1799, you are now considered to be a free person in the state of New York. You can still not vote, and a lot of times you're still kind of stuck in indentured servitude without pay. However, if you were applied as part of the original 1799 Act, you, depending on your birthday again, can still be enslaved up until 1848. So now in 1830, Van Buren has now become the United States Secretary of State under Andrew Jackson. And this census lists 4 enslaved women in his household in residence at the Decatur House. So there's no documented evidence that Van Buren owned these 4 enslaved women. So it seems more likely that he hired out free enslaved workers at the Decatur House. Most likely the owners of these people more or less wrote up contracts for typically locations, not so much for an individual person. So that one great example is actually one of the women who was enslaved there was one named Charlotte Dupuy, who was allowed to stay in Washington while her court case against her owner and former Secretary of State, Henry Clay, was resolved by the U.S. Circuit Court of the District of Columbia. So Charlotte actually presented a lawsuit against Henry Clay, ascertaining that he had promised her freedom and that he had not held up to his end of the deal. So she begins to sue Henry Clay, and so she's waiting for her case to be heard. And so she is still working technically as an enslaved woman at Van Buren's household. Henry Clay, the same Henry Clay who enslaves her, will actually visit Van Buren in September of 1849 for 3 days, that I'll talk about just a little bit later here. And Van Buren's not unique in the situation of relying upon enslaved labor while he's living in Washington, D.C. While there are enslaved laborers on his Decatur staff, there's also enslaved laborers during his White House staff as well, as did many other high-ranking politicians. They used slave labor to maintain their residences, feed their families, and entertain guests. So now the next topic here, 1831. This is a little dark in this one here. So this is Nat Turner's Rebellion, which we might have all heard, maybe don't know the true outcome that this actually, or impact this really had on American society. So Nat Turner, alive from 1800 to 1831, was an enslaved man and preacher who led a rebellion of enslaved people on August 21st, 1831. His actions set off a massacre of up to 200 Black people and a new wave of oppressive legislation prohibiting the education, movement, and assembly of enslaved people. The rebellion also stiffened pro-slavery, anti-abolitionist convictions that persisted in the region until the American Civil War. So essentially, what was Nat Turner's Rebellion? So on August 21st, 1831, Turner and six other enslaved individuals killed his enslaving family, the Travis family. They managed to secure arms and horses and enlist about 75 other enslaved people at their largest extent, and a disorganized insurrection that resulted in the murder of an estimated 55 white people. The incident put fear in the heart of Southerners, ended the organized emancipation movement in that region, resulted in harsher laws against enslaved people, and deepened the schism between those for or against slavery. It also wound up costing Nat Turner his life. So it was one of the key moments kind of leading up to the cause of the American Civil War. So we now kind of jump forward to 1836. Martin Van Buren is currently serving as Vice President of the United States, and the United States Congress is going to institute something called the gag rule. And the gag rule is the first instance of what would become a traditional practice, forbidding the House from considering anti-slavery petitions. So what does that mean? So essentially that means that if someone presents a bill or a law that is anti-slavery, we're just not going to talk about it. We're going to table it, pretend it does not exist, and go on with life. And Van Buren himself endorsed that. He felt like the best way to kind of maintain the Union was to just not talk about slavery. If we just let slavery lie dead, if you will, as a quiet background noise, then eventually we'll all just get over it and move on with our lives. And nothing is really, no presidency is without scandal, and Van Buren's scandal is not his only scandal, but the one most relative to the situation is what's called the Amistad case. So the Amistad case is resulting or relating to in 1839 in Sierra Leone, a group of Menda Africans were literally captured by Portuguese slave hunters. They were then shipped across the Atlantic and smuggled into Cuba. Many perished during the voyage due to the poor traveling conditions, and the surviving 53 Africans were purchased by Spanish enslavers Pedro Mendez and Jose Ruiz. The Africans and their captors left for Haiti on June 28, 1839, aboard La Amistad, where the Amistad case comes from. One of the captured men, whose name is Senpai, or also Joseph Sinke, managed to free himself and the others aboard the vessel. They then actually led a mutiny on the ship and wound up forcing Mendez and Ruiz below deck, taking control of the vessel. Now, the Amistad is eventually intercepted off the coast of New York State here. But rather than brought into New York State, which at this point in time has already begun to, actually abolish slavery, it's really kind of firmly said no new slaves can come into the state now at this point in time. The American vessel ferries them into Connecticut harbors, where Connecticut is kind of a more gray area of slavery at the time. So they're brought to Connecticut, and their legal status is actually then disputed. Were they free men, or are they rightfully enslaved and the property of Spain, including Mendez and Ruiz? So this is the part where Van Buren actually himself gets involved. Van Buren, now the President of the United States, fears repercussions from Spain. He tries to quickly and quietly return the Africans. However, Northern abolitionists funded their defense and argued that the group had been illegally captured, making them therefore free men. They were never legally purchased. They were never supposed to be enslaved people. They were free. They were wrongfully captured. They were forced into this life, as 99% everyone was. After lengthy trials and appeals with the Van Buren administration, the United States Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Africans in a 7-1 decision on March 9th, 1841. This actually happens 5 days after Martin Van Buren leaves office as the president. Cinque and the other 34 survivors departed to return home not until November 1841, after several delays in funding for their voyage. Now, that's the outcome of the Amistad for Van Buren, his involvement. He also actually at one point in time had almost like a secret covert operation waiting to go down. He had a vessel not flying the American colors hidden in a New Haven harbor, waiting to actually whisk the Africans away at one of their court hearings. This plan was discovered and thwarted, but that kind of shows Van Buren's own persistence to undermine the court system. So the Amistad decision further enraged Southern slave owners, who feared the decision could be replicated and encouraged the enslaved men and women of the South. The decision also contributed significantly to the growing divide between North and South as the nation crept closer to civil war. 1844, Van Buren actually loses the Democratic Party presidential nomination to James K. Polk. And this is actually due to Van Buren really kind of taking his first and quite significant time, anti-slavery stance. And it's not that he is anti-slavery, he's not an abolitionist, as we'll kind of correlate between 1844 and 1848, but he is against the westward expansion of slavery, in this particular case in 1844 with Texas. Now, leading into that, 1848, Van Buren runs as a presidential candidate for the Free Soil Party. So what is the Free Soil Party? Because most people who come to our tours here, often this is part where they get really lost. They're like, I've never heard of the Free Soil Party before in my life. Neither did I. Again, I grew up in Georgia. We didn't talk about the Free Soil Party down there. But the Free Soil Party was a short-lived coalition political party, also deemed like a single-issue party from 1840 to 1854. Van Buren becomes involved with them after a fall of the 1844 Democratic National Convention, where again, he loses his nomination to James K. Polk. So at the request of his son, John, Van Buren becomes involved with this single-issue party that is against the Western expansion of slavery, very similar to the stance he took when it came to Texas. But there again, they're not abolitionists. They don't want to end slavery, just kind of contain it where it already exists. So Van Buren actually holds a meeting here at his Lindenwold estate, where he welcomes men from the Free Soil Party into his home to discuss their plans for the upcoming 1848 election. It's actually at the Alchemist dinner party that Van Buren becomes their preferred candidate for the presidency. So Van Buren accepts this offer, runs against his former Democratic Party, and actually winds up costing them the election. He takes just over 10% of the popular vote, which is enough to pull the election away from the Democratic Party and put it into the hands of Whig Party candidate Zachary Taylor. Now, the very next year, 1 year removed from the Free Soil Party attempt on the White House by Van Buren, Van Buren welcomes a famous Whig Party politician and typically a political adversary of his, and named Henry Clay, into his Lindenwold estate here. And so Henry Clay comes, but he does not come here alone. he actually comes here with his enslaved valet by the name of Levi. With Levi as a valet is responsible for tending to Clay's needs, such as setting out his clothes, pouring his drinks, listening to conversation as well. So this is very important, as the primary purpose for Henry Clay's visit is to, one, he's kind of traveling to the United States for his health, but he's also traveling to campaign about something called the 1850 Compromise, which we're going to talk about too just very, very shortly. But first, talk a little more about Levi and maybe Van Buren's, lack of an issue with enslavement. So Levi actually almost didn't come here at all with Henry Clay. He had previously attempted to self-emancipate himself while he and Henry Clay were out in Newport, Rhode Island. So he still makes it here. He returns himself to Henry Clay. Henry Clay claims that he had no plans to recapture Levi, but that's just his own words. We have nothing to cross-reference that with. However, after their stay here, they're traveling to Buffalo, New York. They're there for about a week, and then they begin to travel to Sandusky, Ohio, where Henry Clay somehow makes it all the way to Sandusky before realizing that Levi is no longer with him. Levi had actually self-emancipated himself once again, but this time he travels south to Louisville, Kentucky, and turns himself into a distant family member there of Henry Clay's. Now we have unfortunately no idea if Levi was successful in seeking his emancipation a third and final time. It is likely, or we like to us in Ashland, which is Henry Clay's estate, we believe that he was successful, as by December of that year, Henry Clay wrote to a daughter-in-law of his that he was now using the services of a freeman valet, and there's no further record of Levi. So part of their discussion that they were talking about during Henry Clay's visit here is what's called the Compromise of 1850, which was actually a group of 5 bills that attempted to resolve disputes over slavery and new territories added to the United States in the wake of the Mexican-American War, which was between 1846 and 1848, a war that Martin Van Buren's eldest son, Abraham, actually served in. It admitted California as a free state, left Utah and New Mexico to decide for themselves whether to be a slave state or a free state, defined Texas as a new Texas-Mexico boundary, and made it easier for slave owners to recover runaway slaves under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This was the mastermind of Henry Clay and Democrat Senator Stephen Douglas, a man who Van Buren will later endorse for the presidency in 1860. Lingering resentments over its provisions contributed to the outbreak of the Civil War, and Van Buren himself endorsed this. Now, originally, he did not. Van Buren at first was disturbed by the act as it repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which at that point in time established and admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, and declared a policy of prohibiting slavery in the remaining Louisiana territories north of the 3630 parallel. However, the former president was away at Europe when this bill was passed. So, excuse me, this is actually the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. I got ahead of myself, bear with me here. So 1850, Van Buren is actually in favor of. He endorses it. He endorsed Commerce of 1850. Then we get the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which is where Van Buren is away during its passing. He is in Europe. However, by 1856, he returns. He defends the act in a letter actually to Tammany Hall, which is one of the leading political powerhouses, if you will, here in New York State. He defends the right of Congress to transfer its power to legislate the territories to the territories themselves. This contradicts his 1848 stance, where he wanted to originally withhold or end slavery in new territories. He now believes that the most important goal is to end slavery agitation. And what is slavery agitation? It is this growing anger, resentment, divide between North and South. And he just kind of thinks that if we can kind of quell this tensions going on here. Maybe just not talk about slavery for a while, then it'll be okay. Again, the Kansas-Nebraska Act provides that popular sovereignty, which is a vote of the people of a territory, will decide all questions pertaining to slavery. So no longer is it decided by Congress, it is up to each individual territory to vote on if there will be a free or an enslaving state. It's led to a lot of issues, as actually we kind of got the situation where people were fleeing to borders, fleeing to other states to vote in places where they don't actually live. But it again has kind of cemented this new contention, and it failed as an act. It did not really postpone anything or any type of contentious acts. 1857 is the Dred Scott versus Sandford Act, which I already mentioned about, that the Constitution essentially is not intended to apply to Black men and women, whether free or still enslaved, a decision that Van Buren endorsed. 1859, we get John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. I'll talk about this a little bit longer here. November 1860, Abraham Lincoln is elected president of the United States. Lincoln defeats Stephen Douglas from the Democratic Party in the 1860 presidential election. In that election, Van Buren himself actually endorses Stephen Douglas. At this point in time, our nation is slipping into civil war. December 20th, 1860, secession begins when South Carolina on December 20th votes unanimously to secede from the Union. After secession began, Van Buren agreed with compromise proposals to prevent a civil war. However, he favored a combination that would stop the ultra-abolitionists, which leads into 1861, where at the New York State Democratic Convention, Van Buren denounces both secessionists for their monstrous heresies and the extreme Republicans whose speeches, he says, are full of mischief. He called for a national convention to discuss the institution of slavery, and if the convention failed, he was prepared to let the South go in peace. So he's still kind of showing some of these Southern sympathies, where he is saying that we need to have a discussion about this, we need to talk about it, we can't ignore it any longer, we've ignored it, it hasn't done any good, we need to talk about it now, but it's a little too late. And he's still saying that if we can't reach an agreement, then the South should be able to go. It's kind of the stance that he wound up taking. Now, in April 12th of 1861, the Confederate forces attack Fort Sumter, and then just 4 days later, former President Franklin Pierce writes to former Presidents Van Buren, John Tyler, Millard Fillmore, and Buchanan about the possibility of a chance to discuss this new dire situation. Pierce asked Van Buren, as the elder statesman, to call the meeting. However, in his reply, Van Buren expresses doubt that the meeting would even do any good. He instead insists that President Buchanan should call it, as he was the most recent president. And then on July 24th, 1862, Martin Van Buren dies at his Lindenwold home, and a nation torn apart by the very same thing that he tried to postpone, aid in, keep a union together. He leaves behind a broken country, uncertain of its own future, just as he was. A nation, if you will, torn asunder by something he desperately tried to navigate for nearly half of his political career. So that kind of leads the end of the timeline. I want to kind of give you a chance to look at the faces of some of our key figures here. So we have, again, Zheng or Joseph Cinque, Frederick Douglass, one of the greatest leaders at the time. Douglass, actually, interestingly enough, endorsed Martin Van Buren in the 1840 election for the Free Soil Party. When asked why he chose to endorse Martin Van Buren, who had a very muddled stance on enslavement, Frederick Douglass more or less said that what is morally right is not always politically possible, in reference that Van Buren was more or less the lesser of the evil candidates. We then have Dred Scott, the namesake for the 1857 landmark United States case. And then lastly, we have Nat Turner as well. And then kind of giving you an example again of Martin Van Buren on John Brown. I mentioned John Brown's raid. So John Brown is a famed American abolitionist. He is alive from 1800 to 1859. And he first gained national attention during the Bleeding Kansas crisis of the late 1850s, which was over whether Kansas would enter the Union as a slave state or a free state. Van Buren actually doesn't really have a lot of kind things to say about John Brown. He views him a man of lawless disposition. And he actually shows further displeasure at Brown for waging war on a section of the country distinguished for hospitality, personal manners, amiable disposition, love of country, and respect for principle and public virtue. This is reference to his failed incitement of a slave rebellion at Harper's Ferry preceding the American Civil War, which happens in 1859. Van Buren reverts to his old states' rights philosophy at this point in time. He refers to the original 13 states as the Old Confederacy. He also praises Virginians for a long history, as he says, of trying to restrict slavery. Although he seemed to believe slavery was morally wrong, he felt it was equally wrong to resort to political solutions or to abolish it by the sword, similar to a method of John Brown. The North, he concluded, should show goodwill towards the South. Again, more of these kind of Southern sympathy statements. Now, this last story here that I really have for us tonight, before I kind of go like my final thoughts and conclusions, open the floor for some questions here. This is really one that actually I just discovered this year. So I have real or fiction, as I have not been able to confirm its true validity. I'm going to read this text to you. I know it's probably very hard to read on your screens. So this is an excerpt from the New York Evening Post of Friday, September 20th, 1839. So it says, Mr. Van Buren, those who know him best have always appreciated the unaffected kindness of his heart. We have heard many instances of this, but none more interesting than a circumstance which happened during his recent visit to his native county. An old Black woman, bent with age and feeble from infirmity, was seen pushing her way through the crowd towards the president. Some of the bystanders inquired her reason for doing so. In reply, she said that some 30 years ago, she and her children were enslaved, and her master was about selling 2 of her children and depriving her of them. She was, of course, in great distress about it. Mr. Van Buren heard of her situation, purchased the children, and presented them to their mother, and she had traveled on foot for a distance of more than 20 miles at the advanced age of 85 years to show him that she had yet remembered his kindness. So was this a true story, or was this a political move to win stronger favor in the North? And the reason why I question it is the date of its publication, September 20th, 1839. For those of you unfamiliar with Martin Van Buren's presidency, it is often regarded as a very poor one. Van Buren's riding an all-time political high when he enters the White House in 1837. He had soundly won the 1836 election. I won't say soundly. It was a convincing win, but it was still closer than he anticipated. However, he is president of the United States. He thinks he has finally made it. He has made the pinnacle, the apex of political achievement. However, within 1 month of Van Buren taking office of the presidency, the economy of the United States collapses in what we today call the Panic of 1837. And it is largely a result of both Martin Van Buren and Andrew Jackson's refusal to reestablish the charter for the Second National Bank of the United States. So Martin Van Buren's popularity takes a massive drop to save the economy, and now he's getting a lot of pressure from the South as well. The South doesn't trust him. There's a lot of growing unrest, social and civil and political unrest about the issue of slavery and enslavement, its expansion, its protection. And so the South doesn't think Van Buren is a strong enough candidate to essentially protect slavery where they deem it important. And so Van Buren maybe could be trying to double down on support in the North. Maybe this is trying to win him favor with people who don't trust him here at North. They think he's too pro-slavery, he's too pro-South. So here is maybe a convincing moral argument, appeal to the emotions, if you will. Van Buren maybe doing something good for a formerly enslaved woman. So with my final thoughts, kind of a rehash on Van Buren's stance on slavery, which I think can probably best be defined as a battle between morality and legality. He seemed to be personally and morally against the institution, but was reluctant to strike out against it. He chose instead to follow Andrew Jackson and sympathize with the South. Van Buren proved this to many when he became the president of the United States, the first president to directly mention slavery in his inaugural address. However, his statement was that he recognized it, he acknowledged it, but that he would maintain the status quo. He was not the president to essentially rock the boat, if you will. So with that, I think I am a little bit ahead here, but I will... Well, that's my closing slide. Stop sharing my screen for just a minute here, and I'll look in the chat. If anybody has any questions, please just type into the chat here.
Right. So if anybody has questions, feel free to just enter them in the chat and we'll both have a look at that. We have one chat that is just a comment. This was phenomenal. I appreciate the balanced presentation of a complex human in an equally complicated portion of our country's history. Indeed. Looks like we have a question in the Q&A. Why did Kinderhook have such a large enslaved population compared to most other Columbia County towns?
So that is a great question. So Kinderhook has a very unique history of being an old Dutch community. And so people from the Netherlands really kind of were the first ones to bring enslaved people here to New York State. And so the economy here is mostly agriculture and mostly centered around free labor, so enslaved laborers. So even by the time Van Buren comes around, even though the New Netherland colony begins around the early 1600s and the 1630s, come the 1780s, there is still a very strong Dutch influence here. And so that is kind of the reasoning behind it. And so Kinderhook's still very rural. It's still rural today. And when Van Buren's alive here, he holds a 225-acre farm. His father has a farm. Most people here have farms. And they're using this old Dutch method of free labor, if you will, to run their properties. And so I hope that answers that question. I do see we have one from Chelsea in the chat. Is there an African burial ground in Kinderhook? There is, and sadly, I myself have not been to it yet. I don't live here in Kinderhook, so that's probably it's neglect on my part. I need to get there. But there is one here. We actually have a map on the park website that actually notes where it's located. We also have another one too. What reference materials would you suggest looking towards for more information on this topic? Great question. So if you're looking to kind of get insight on Van Buren's own personal thoughts, I highly recommend, actually it's a book by Donald Cole. It's called Martin Van Buren and the American Political System. Absolutely phenomenal read. It really gets into his insights, some of his stances that he has, why he thinks the way he thinks. In general, actually the White House has some really great resources too on the enslaved households of every former president who was an enslaver. And that's very interesting as well. It's actually where you can look at a photocopy letter of the letter that Van Buren receives from Hammond in 1824. And did New York actually pass legislation in 1827 to free slaves, or was that just the year when the previous legislature finally let them go? So in 1827, I got a little muddled there when I was going on. So to kind of rehash, they didn't actually pass any further legislation. That was all relating back to 1799 and 1817. So 1799 is important, and that is one that they state where enslaved people born on or after July 4th of 1799 will be emancipated on their 20th birthday if they're a male, or 25th birthday if they are a woman. So July 4th, 1827 was the first date that an enslaved male could be emancipated within New York State, as according to the 1799 law. 1817 is more or less, doesn't override 1799. It just kind of states that we are acknowledging the enslaved people before July 4th, 1799. They will be emancipated on July 4th, 1827. However, that does not apply to the 1799 law. Those born under that will still could be enslaved or indentured up until 1848.
Okay, any more questions? Wait just a little longer to see if anybody has anything, and then we'll wrap it up.
Sounds good. You are welcome, William. Thank you for attending. I was a little nervous, so hopefully was all clear today.
Question about when women would have been emancipated.
So women would actually be earlier. Women were 25 years, men were 28. They felt that they could work a man longer than a woman. So with that reference, it could be a little earlier for a woman than a man. 1848, though, was the final years pretty much that an enslaved person was considered here in New York State. Although the process or the institution of indentured servitude still continued.
Okay, well, it looks like there are no more questions. Oh, wait a minute. I see something in the Q&A. Oh, just a thank you saying that this was fascinating. So,
and then we have another one from Steve saying women's indentured servitude ended. So I never really found a true solid end date stated anywhere. Several sources stated the year 1848. I couldn't quite find where they got that from. I was using sources from Cornell, New York State itself. So I don't know if there was another law that stated 1848, but that was kind of the most common date that I found. Whether that was just another, gap from 27 to 1848, I unfortunately don't have a 100% answer for you.
and there's a question, did Stuyvesant splitting off of Kinderhook affect those census numbers you showed? And I don't know when Stuyvesant and Kinderhook split.
I don't know either, to be honest, but I would not doubt it. I do know that Kinderhook's boundaries were different, so it could have been, kind of affecting all these different numbers. I'm sure it had influence over it. It was still mind-boggling to think about a small rural village being such a large contributing factor to the enslaved population within the state.
Okay, well, it looks like that's all the questions. So thank you very much, Zachary. It was really very, very interesting. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we have recorded this, so we will post it on our website, on the Columbia County Library's website. And hopefully that will be up, later this week. I will send out the link to anybody who registered. And we have one other question. There are lots of rural areas. Why Kinderhook?
It's a very good question. Why Kinderhook? And for that, I don't have the answer for you, unfortunately. I feel like I'm saying that a lot here at the end. It could have been the situation of a perfect example of Kinderhook being one of the few areas to really they kind of really held on to these traditional Dutch principles longer than most other villages. And so this traditional Dutch tie of the history of slavery really kind of infiltrating every part of your life was an old Dutch tradition. The Dutch were, again, the first ones really to bring enslavement here to our region. Kinderhook itself didn't stop speaking Dutch until one of the last areas. Really kind of held on to these Dutch ties for the longest amount of time. So that could be why. It could have been others, could have been influences. It could have been from people like the Van Nesses, the Van Burens, kind of holding on to these ties and really being the proprietors of enslavement in the area here. I put this last slide back up just in case anyone has any other questions. You can email me at the email here. I'll try and email you the best I can, response back, or just want to keep in touch. Feel free. Did you have a question, Christopher?
I have allowed you to talk, Christopher, if you have a question. I guess not. Okay. So thank you again, Zachary.
Thank you.
And we will have this up online as soon as we can. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.